Chapter 12. Even with the bright morning sun streaming in her bedchamber window, Penelope's hair looked dull and drab. The poultice worked perfectly, she thought as she ran the brush through once more. Now I seem more my old self anyway. It reminds me of my Swansburn days. And if the children notice the change in my hair, I will simply tell them I've turned apples to blackberries. Clearly, optimism can be a very fine trait, with the power to turn lemons into lemonade and apples into blackberries and so forth. But just as a scrumptious tart Felipe will cause the most dreadful tummy ache if eaten in excess, too much optimism can plunge one into the precarious state of mind known as optumuchism. Alas, it is a slippery slope. True optimism, as Agatha Swanburne defined it, is the habit of expecting happy endings in a way that keeps one cheerfully working to make them come true. But optumuchism is optimism taken much, much too far. It puts one at a real risk of getting carried away, or even going overboard, especially when at sea. Caught in the throes of optumuchism, people become convinced that nothing can go wrong. They invest their life savings in harebrained schemes, by transatlantic passages on unsinkable ships named Titanic, and generally fail to recognize when it's time to try Plan B. Note that in the expression Plan B, the letter B does not stand for anything in particular. It merely means that when Plan A falls to pieces and disaster looms, it is wise to have an alternative ready. Penelope tumbled from the velocipede, prompted, as you recall, by her optimuchistic belief that she could ride blindly through an intersection while sniffing for elephants, had been a painful lesson, and Penelope had already resolved to keep her optimism within reason from that day forward. But old habits die hard. Despite her good intentions, Penelope couldn't help being cheerful about the lackluster condition of her hair. It's a pity there's no way to tell in advance how much optimism is the correct amount, she thought, as she pinned her dull, drab locks into a dull, drab bun. But I fear such judgments can only be made with the gift of hindsight. In this, she was correct. And like a mail-order snow shovel that gets lost by the post office and finally turns up in July, the gift of hindsight always arrives too late to be of practical use. Still, the day was off to a promising start. Simon was on his way, and the children had updated their journals with pictures of elephants, orangutans, and some brave attempts to spell Peloponnesian. Alexander had used his wobbly cursive to address all the picture postcard to Nutsawoo, Treetops, Ashton Place. Beowulf had decorated each card with a pen and ink drawing of a trimery, maybe, which, as you already know, was the many-oared warship used by ancient Greeks during the Peloponnesian War. And Cassiopeia had signed them Wavlu Flam Cass. Now she was bouncing with eagerness to drop them in the post. All in all, it seemed to Penelope that a modest amount of optimism could be safely given free rein. Perhaps things are looking up, she thought, as she led the children downstairs to wait for Simon, for it was already nearing 11 o'clock. The children would be safe with her, and once they located Madame Ionesco and learned what Simon had discovered in his bookstore excursions, the mysteries posed by Miss Mortimer and the guidebook would doubtless be solved before tea time. The children would find it all highly educational, and Penelope had the pleasant company of Mr. Harley Dickinson to look forward to. Truly, what could go wrong? First, Simon didn't show up. 11 o'clock came and went, then 11:30, then noon. The children grew restless and began to whimper. It is not easy to wait patiently for someone who is late. In fact, there are many who would grow deeply angry. They would spend the time preparing themselves to boldly confront the tardy person and read them the riot act, an expression that means to scold someone so thoroughly that he or she will feel as if they had been sprayed full blast with a fire hose. But Penelope put her trust in Simon, and her faith in people was not so easily swayed. First, she waited. Then she worried. Then she had what is nowadays called a brainstorm. "Contraband!" she shouted abruptly, much to the surprise of the Incorrigibles, who had decided to occupy themselves by building a model of a trimery out of bits of potted fern that sat in the entryway. It was Alexander's idea, and a clever one, too, for the fern fronds served nicely as the 3 tiers of oars that jutted from each side of the ship. "Contrawoo?" Beowulf asked, looking up from his work. Penelope paced the slippery floor in deep concentration, for her powers of deduction were at full throttle. Contraband means goods which have been illegally obtained. She paused to explain. She was still their governess, after all. It is the stolen velocipede that has waylaid Mr. Harley Dickinson. I'm certain of it. He must have been stopped by a police officer, for why else would he not be here as planned? Thrilled at this dramatic turn of events, the children took up the cry, "Contraband! Contraband!" They whooped. Miss Clark had been upstairs looking for something, but now she waddled down to see what all the ruckus was about. Now, now, dearies, don't tell me you're playing Minotaurs again. I thought we learned our lesson about that. Not Minotaur, Matador. Never mind, Miss Clark. Penelope seized the housekeeper by both arms. Our friend Mr. Harley Dickinson may have been thrown in the lockup for being in possession of stolen property. We must help him. Miss Clark clucked and shook her head. You shouldn't get mixed up with that sort, Miss Lumley. That's a bad business all around. Although just hearing the word stolen property put me in mind of old Mr. Clark, rest his soul. She placed a hand over her heart and waved off, as a wave of nostalgia softened her features. They tossed him in about once a week in his prime. Disorderly in public was practically his middle name. Penelope would have liked very much to hear more about the obviously fascinating dearly departed Mr. Clark, but she suspected the tale might not be suitable for children's ears. And in any case, she was in a hurry. I assure you, Miss Clark, if any charge has been made, it is a false one, and it will be up to us to prove him innocent. But how? She concentrated once more. I know. Lord Frederick has a friend, Judge Quincy, whom I am sure can sort things out, for Simon was in his company all day yesterday. Surely there's no better alibi than the word of a judge. Where might we find him? His Honor? He's a strange duck, isn't he? Gives me goose-flesh to think of him somehow. Miss Clark gave a little shiver, as if to demonstrate. You will find Judge Quincy at Lord Frederick's club. I know it for a fact. The gentlemen had plans to meet for lunch and a game of billiards. Do you happen to know the address? Penelope asked, for after her painful lesson from the previous day, she knew it would be opta-too-muchism to find Lord Frederick's club by, say, following the smell of expensive cigars. Do I know the address? Who do you think's been sending over Lord Frederick's clean shirts, shaving kits, new spectacles, skin creams, headache lozenges, and whatever else his lordship demands? In fact, I was just about to have old Timothy ride over with this. She waved the book she was holding. Lord Frederick's Almanac. He wants it, and he wants it right away. You'd think the great Lord Ashton was a sailor, the way he refers to his almanac all day long, Miss Clark said with a sigh. He checks the moon and the tides the way other men check the financial pages. But to each his own, I suppose. The children and I will bring the almanac to Lord Frederick ourselves. Penelope practically snatched the volume from Miss Clark. And Timothy need not trouble himself. We shall take the bus. She turned to the Incorrigibles. Thank you for your patience while waiting, children. And that's very impressive building work, I must say. But put it aside for now, for at last it is time to go. Theatrical haunts with Simawoo? Cassiopeia asked, confused. That was Plan A. Now we are switching to Plan B, Penelope exclaimed. Perhaps we can find Simon in prison and obtain his freedom. Then we can resume Plan A after lunch. Button your coat, please. Don't lose the almanac, Miss Clark cautioned, or Lord Frederick will have my head. We go to prison? Alexander asked nervously. Guillotine? Beowulf added, no doubt because of Miss Clark's comment about Lord Frederick having her head. Simawoo no prison, Cassiopeia insisted. He's perfectly nice. Penelope pinned her hat firmly to her dark, dull hair. It was still her old hat. With all the excitement, she had not yet had time to shop for a new one. You're quite right, Cassiopeia, and dear me, nobody is going to the guillotine. Come along, everyone. We must speak to Judge Quincy. At the Swansburn Academy for Poor Bright Females, all the girls were taught to have excellent manners, and Penelope was no exception. She knew perfectly well that there was something not quite right about examining another person's property without permission. And yet, as she rode the bus with the 3 incorrigible children seated next to her, and Lord Frederick's precious almanac in her lap, she found herself deeply curious about the contents of this book. She longed to peek inside the covers, and was finding it difficult to resist doing so. The children were also interested in the almanac, and peppered her with questions. What is an almanac? Why a sailor? Why have Miss Clark's head? Beowulf made a throat-cutting gesture that was so impressively gruesome it made his sister squeal with delight. Before answering, Penelope glanced at the address Miss Clark had written down for her, and craned her head out the window to see where they were. 3 more stops, children. Very well. An almanac is like a detailed calendar in book form that includes many facts about nature. It's the sort of information that a farmer or a sailor might find useful, she explained. For example, the almanac will predict when the last frost will come and the ground will be ready for planting, when to expect a dry spell or a rainy one, times of sunrises and sunsets, ocean tides, phases of the moon, and so on. Moon, Cassiopeia said approvingly. The children were very fond of moons, though a full one did tend to get them a bit worked up. Yes, moon. Penelope's desire to teach got the better of her. Impulsively, she flipped open the almanac to the appropriate diagram. Here, I'll show you. These are the phases of the moon: new, crescent, quarter, gibbous, and full. See how it waxes and wanes? And here are all the dates for the year, and, oh, this is odd. For Lord Frederick, or someone, had circled every single date that there would be a full moon for the whole year. The children tried to count the circles until they made themselves dissolve into laughter and had to start over again. Moon, 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 moon. But it kept them occupied until the bus neared their destination. Why should Lord Frederick be so concerned about the full moon? Penelope wondered. Perhaps it has to do with his hunting habit, for those would be the brightest nights to go out in the forest. Time to stand up, children. This is our stop. They alighted directly in front of the address Miss Clark had provided. In terms of grandeur, the building felt someplace in between the London General Post Office and Buckingham Palace, which is to say that it was very grand indeed. A burly doorman stood watch at the entrance. Happily, his uniform did not include a single tuft of fur. When Penelope and the children approached, he scowled. State your business. I have something to deliver to Lord Frederick Ashton. Penelope tried to peer around the doorman, but could see nothing. The big fellow loomed too large. Is he inside? I'll take it to him, miss. The doorman had held out his beefy hand. Instinctively, she hugged the almanac close. Thank you, but I have instructions to hand the item to him personally. It is an object of particular importance to Lord Ashton. Moon, 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 Cassiopeia explained helpfully, while her brothers nodded. The doorman gave them a curious look. No offense, but this is the Fox and Hounds Club. It is a gentleman's club, no place for women and children. Penelope thought of Simon. In her mind's eye, she saw him locked in a dungeon somewhere. She stood straight as a poker and spoke in her most no-nonsense voice. I am Lord Ashton's employee. He requested this volume to be brought to him at once, and that is what I intend to do. And these children are his legal wards, she added, though she wasn't sure how often Lord Frederick recalled that the Incorrigibles even existed. The doorman looked the children over. Alexander and Beowulf bowed, and Cassiopeia curtsied. He frowned. Very well, make it quick, though. Lord Ashton's party is in the billiard room, just inside and to the left. Needless to say, Penelope had never entered a wealthy gentleman's club before. The dark wood panelings, sparkling chandeliers, and patterned carpets were as luxurious as one would find in any fine house, but there was a subtle masculine difference in the feeling of the place. From distant rooms she heard men's voices, gruff and serious, or ringing out with bold laughter. The air carried the scent of pipe tobacco and imported cigars, mixed with the spice of cologne and the saddle smell of expensive leather. She turned left, as directed, with the children close behind her. Now she heard the sharp clack-clack of billiard cues, and then the muffled thud as the ball hit the felted rim of the table and ricocheted into the pocket. The door to the billiard room was half open. A group of Lord Frederick's friends were gathered around the green-topped table, cues in hand. There was the Earl of Maytag and Baron Hoover, both of whom Penelope remembered all too well from Ashton Place's holiday ball. Judge Quincy did not appear to be with them. Who goes there? Baron Hoover called, turning to the door. What's this? I'm afraid you'll have taken the wrong turn, miss. Quite the wrong turn indeed. Then he looked again. Why, it's that governess person, isn't it? And aren't those Ashton's famous wolf children? Good day, Baron Hoover. Now all the gentlemen had stopped playing and were looking at Penelope, their expression a mix of annoyance and curiosity. I'm sorry to disturb your game. The children and I came to deliver this. She held out the almanac. Lord Frederick seized it at once. My almanac! Blast this thing, I'm always losing it. He patted it and promptly tucked it in his pocket. To the men, he shrugged and joked. One must stay a step ahead of the weather. Wouldn't want to be caught in the rain without a bumper chute, what? Pardon me, Penelope spoke quickly before she lost their attention. I was told Judge Quincy would be here. Is he expected? He's here, all right. He just stepped outside for some air. The Earl of Maytag snapped, for it was his turn at billiards and he was impatient to resume playing. What do you want to bother Quincy about? Penelope willed her voice to sound calm. I am in need of some legal advice. Don't get caught. That's all the legal advice anyone needs. Maytag took his shot and dropped the ball in the side pocket with a neat click. Possession is 9/10 of the law, added Baron Hoover, relighting his pipe. In other words, finders keepers. Speaking of which, what is the condition of those incorrigible pups these days? Lord Frederick squinted in the direction of the children who huddled in the doorway. Still howling and what-not? Pups, don't be rude, Freddie. At Christmas they were spouting Latin, as I recall. An impressive trick, I must say. Maytag applied chalk to the tip of his cue. Tell us, children, what have you been studying lately? Peloponnesian War, mumbled Alexander. Bears, said Beowulf, sounding defiant. Moon, 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 Cassiopeia counted. The child opened her mouth in a way that let Penelope know she was about to let out a howl of anxiety. She clapped her hand over the girl's face and said, We've been enjoying the cultural sights of London. Today we hope to have a tour of the theatre district, but I fear our guide may have been detained by the police. If so, it is all a misunderstanding, for he is a perfectly nice young man. That's why I wish to speak to his honor. Surely you do not mean Mr. Harley Dickinson? Judge Quincy entered the room with 3 long strides, bearing a snifter of some dark, syrupy liquid. Is our young playwright in trouble with the law? I'm disappointed to hear it. He hardly seems the type. The theatre attracts all sorts of shady characters. Always has, Baron Hoover observed. Alexander nodded. Aristophanes. Gesundheit, Baron Hoover replied, waving his pipe in the other direction. Sorry about the smoke. I'll ring for someone to open a window. Alexander was about to explain that Aristophanes was the famous Greek dramaticist who wrote satirical plays about the Peloponnesian War, but Penelope spoke first. As I said, it's a misunderstanding. Do you remember the velocipede I was riding yesterday? Judge Quincy settled himself in a leather club chair and swirled his drink. It would be hard to forget, he said wryly, seeing as how you crashed it into my carriage. I'm sorry about that. Penelope hoped no one would notice her blush. Mr. Harley Dickinson used the velocipede to run an errand, but there's a chance it may be stolen property, and now I fear he's being held by the authorities. Why do you think that? Because he didn't show up for our appointment this morning. And it did not occur to you that he may have simply found something better to do? No, sir, it did not. I see. Judge Quincy looked vaguely amused. Miss Lumley, I'm afraid that legal problems are never as simple as they may first appear. Before I render a verdict, let me consult my colleagues. He addressed the men at the billiards table. What say you, gentlemen? A man is found riding a velocipede that turns out to be stolen, but he claims he is not the thief. Opinions? The Earl of Maytag didn't hesitate. Caught with stolen property? Hang him. No honest man scoots around on pilfered wheels. He's obviously guilty of something. Lord Ashton shook his head in disagreement. Finders keepers, I say. A velocipede belongs to the person who's riding it. Case closed, what? Baron Hoover paused to take a shot, which missed, and straightened from the table with a grunt. Now, Freddie, that's a bit unfeeling, isn't it? What about the poor chap who owned the velocipede to begin with? Doesn't he deserve some justice? Chances are he'll let it outside a shop and someone rode off on it. Or maybe the thief thought it was abandoned and free for the taking. Could have been an honest mistake. I say more investigation is required. Judge Quincy leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. You see how difficult the work of a judge is, Miss Lumley. 3 men, 3 different opinions. Penelope was flummoxed. To her, the situation had seemed quite straightforward, until now. And why had Maytag found it necessary to mention hanging in front of the children? Your Honor, Mr. Harley Dickinson was with you yesterday at the zoo. Surely you would have been able to explain to the police that he couldn't have done anything wrong. Judge Quincy shook his head. Unless we know exactly what time the property was stolen, and from what address, an alibi is irrelevant. But what if we found the true owner of the velocipede and returned it? Wouldn't that solve anything? Everything? In a city the size of London, Judge Quincy smiled, it would be no more possible to determine the rightful owner of that velocipede than it would be to determine the origins of those remarkable pupils of yours. Respectfully, I disagree. Her fear made Penelope bold. For how can one say something is impossible if one hasn't tried? For a tense moment, it was as if Penelope and Judge Quincy were the only two people in the room. Have you tried to discover their origins, then? Do tell us what you've learned, he murmured. You mean the children's? Why, no, I was talking about the velocipede. Far more interesting topic, I quite agree, the Earl of Maytag interjected. First, we must determine, was the velocipede lost, abandoned, or stolen? In my view, it makes all the difference. For if it was lost or abandoned, then I agree with Ashton. Finders keepers. Hear, hear, Lord Ashton said absently. He was busy thumbing through his almanac. But if stolen, hanging's too good for him. Unless Miss Lumley can point us in the direction of the real thief, of course. Penelope thought of the little urchin boy. Perhaps he had stolen the velocipede. She'd assumed as much, but she couldn't know for certain, could she? And with all this talk of hanging, how could she dream of accusing a poor waif of a child, who likely had no one to teach him right from wrong to begin with? Or perhaps Judge Quincy was right. Perhaps Simon had simply found something better to do this morning. Even as she considered this, she didn't believe it. Call her optimistic, but she didn't think Simon would have broken his word. So, which is it, Miss Lumley? Judge Quincy held out his hands. Lost, abandoned, or stolen? I cannot say for certain where the velocipede came from, Your Honor, she replied. I'm sorry. I see now that I shouldn't have troubled you with this matter. He nodded, as if he'd known that this would be her conclusion all along. Baron Hoover chuckled. My advice is to not get tangled up with the law to begin with. Once you do, it's a sticky wicket, that's for sure. Not easy to extract oneself. Spider web, Beowulf observed, but Alexander shushed him gently. Should you ever see Mr. Harley Dickinson again, the judge said smoothly, do tell him I wish him all the best, and trust this incident will serve as a valuable lesson. By the way, are you feeling well, Miss Lumley? He paused. Your complexion seems rather pale today. I hope you're not coming down with a cold. Penelope adjusted her hat to cover as much of her hair as possible, for she knew that dark hair made her face look sallow by comparison. I'm quite well, I assure you. Good day. Desperate to leave, she turned and shepherded the children towards the door. But as she did, Judge Quincy's words rang in her head. Those three remarkable pupils. Have you tried to discover their origins? Lost, abandoned, or stolen? Lost, abandoned, or stolen? Could the Incorrigibles have been stolen? Not lost in the wood while being neglected by the world's most careless parents, or abandoned there by the world's most cruel and unfeeling parents, but actually stolen from what must surely be the world's most worried and heartbroken parents? It was such an awful thought that she couldn't prevent herself from exclaiming, Oh, my! Baron Hoover was on his feet. What is it, my dear? If Penelope were to answer honestly, she would say, I just realized that I had formed a poor opinion of two people whom I have never met, and now I wish to apologize, but can't because I don't know who they are. But instead she blurted, I just remembered that the children haven't yet taken their naps. We must be on our way. Good day. At this, the Incorrigibles began to protest. Not sleepy, Lamawoo. Awake, awake, awoo! No nap! Museum! Begged Cassiopeia. We will discuss it outside, children. This way, please. As she hurried them out of the billiards room, the door, ever so slowly, closed behind them. And as it did, she overheard, Those wolf children of yours are positively mad. I can't imagine why you bother with them, Freddie. They must be dreadful expenses to feed. And the noise. All that barking and yapping and wooing. Why not give them to the zoo? Finders keepers, Lord Frederick said. Let's play more billiards, shall we? Give the children to the zoo, Penelope fumed. What sort of people were they who could talk in such callous ways? And was it truly possible that the Incorrigibles themselves might be, in a sense, contraband? It was a spider web indeed, and Penelope felt as if she were trapped in one of those frightening dreams that everyone has now and again, in which a miniature Penelope was pinned to the sticky middle of the web with a giant black-robed arachnid bearing Judge Quincy's face scuttling even nearer. It was an unpleasant image, to say the least, and she quickly dispelled it by concentrating on her other surroundings. The only other people waiting for the bus were a mother with 2 babies in one of the new-wheeled perambulators that could be pushed from behind. The babies were at the age where they could sit up quite well and enjoy the scenery. They were dressed alike and appeared to be twins. Their mother entertained them with a variety of rattles, plush toys, nursery rhymes, and games of peekaboo, and amusing little songs about farm animals. The babies laughed and clapped their chubby hands, while the Incorrigibles watched, mesmerized. Penelope found it a fascinating scene as well. What a clever idea, making a miniature carriage to push babies in. But soon she realized that it was the mother's loving sing-song attentions that had so thoroughly captured the Incorrigibles' attention, just as it had the babies. "Never fear, somehow we'll figure out who your parents are," she so dearly wanted to tell them. But she didn't, for she would hate to make such a promise and not be able to keep it. Penelope had the unshakable confidence of a Swansburn girl about most things, but when it came to finding missing parents, well, put it this way, she had not had much luck with it in her own life so far. And frankly, since she still needed to rescue Simon and sort out the business of the stolen velocipede, the mystery of a particular guidebook, and the case of the missing soothsayer, it seemed best to postpone tackling any further mysteries for the time being. "One conundrum at a time," she concluded, "and none on an empty stomach. Or, in the words of Agatha Swanburne, first, eat." At last the bus arrived. Alexander and Beowulf were delighted to hold the 2 babies as Penelope helped the woman lift her carriage aboard. During the ride, Cassiopeia entertained the infants with her own doggy-themed version of the farm animal song, in which every animal either barked or howled. The babies found it hilarious. Penelope watched this odd and yet adorable scene unfold. "Sooner or later I will find your parents. I will make sure of it," she thought. But aloud she said only, "One more stop until Muffinshire Lane. Alexander, would you please ring the bell?"